Welcome to the YeurDreamin, the conference, independent conference, tailored to multiple different Salesforce specialists, from admin to an architect. And this year it's virtual, so you're seeing me in recording. I'm George, and I'm going to talk about Apex anti-patterns. This session is specifically tailored towards the Salesforce developers and Salesforce architects. I have some authority to talk about the topic. I'm writing Apex since a long time ago. I'm 3D certified. I'm working as an architect my last 6 years. I was talking about the same topic quite oftenly in the past, especially in my days when I was in Kiev Salesforce Developer user group. But now I'm doing this talk in English, and also I'm doing this talk in this conference. Plenty of things changed since. So if you saw me speaking in 2017, you can probably notice a lot of changes. So let's jump back to the topic. This is Apex anti-patterns, and I want you all to do the psychological experiment. Close your eyes. I'm going to tell you Apex anti-pattern. What is the first thing coming to your mind when I'm telling you this? What is this? You may open your eyes and think about it. If it's DML in a for loop, you're probably among the majority of people. Unfortunately or fortunately, looking at the book definition of the anti-pattern as a term, it's not precisely that. Let's jump back. Let's think about something which is not code, and I'll try to explain what anti-pattern is in another example. Have a look at this. This is the QWERTY typewriter, the actual Remington typewriter with a layout of keys, which we use till date. We're using it for 150 years already. Take a look at your keyboard if you're looking at this at your home PC, and you notice that, unless you're French, Belgium, where you use AZERTY layout, that layout is more or less the same. There are still some practical changes. There is extra keys, dead keys added. There is 1 and 0 probably on your keyboard, but the whole idea is exactly the same. Back in the day, it was considered as a best practice. Why? It's an urban legend. It's not entirely the reason why QWERTY was designed, this layout was approved, but it was believed that if you use a QWERTY keyboard, QWERTY layout, you're reducing the hits of the type bars, because you're typing with 2 hands. It's allowing you to type most of the English words with 2 hands, which was very critical for typewriters, because back in the day, your texting would be stopped if your type bars are clinching. Therefore, QWERTY was a very superior design to that. However, people were challenging and were asking if that's the actual best ergonomical layout of keyboard. And I think, once again, almost 100 years from now, Dvorak already found out that it's not. Most of the people are right-handed. I'm left-handed, but 90% of world population is right-handed. And if you type with QWERTY layout, if you're using plain English, most likely you're using your left hand more than 50% compared to your right, which was the idea behind Dvorak layout, which utilizes the right hand more. There are some other layouts. Once again, if you're using QWERTY, if your language is using Latin, but it's not English, it might not be optimal for your language to use QWERTY as a layout. But QWERTY was a best practice then, since it was resolving a very typewriter problem. Now, if you look at it, it's not the best solution, really. It's most common, yes, but it's not the best. You can think about other things, like, for instance, our architecture of most of the modern PC, x86, it's all backward compatibility. It's coming back because memory was slow back in the day. Now it's not. Now you have other architectures like ARM, which are not having this bottleneck. They are designed without this constraint in mind. So you can think about an anti-pattern as something which was the best practice, very commonly used, and actually initially appearing. However, it has some consequences which are bad, and sometimes the number of those consequences is bigger than the good ones. But anti-pattern is not a bad code, precisely, or the design smell, bad design, bad architecture. Apparently it's not. A lot of things we having currently, they are anti-pattern. They are very commonly used, and they were initially appearing, but now we are understanding that probably that's not the best design. Anti-pattern is not, you cannot really count it out. You cannot really say, well, our business is using 84% of anti-patterns with whatever static rule code analysis. It's not entirely that. And it's definitely not the dark pattern, which is a different thing. It's from the user experience. So just by a textbook definition, and we can definitely tell this, DML in a for loop is not an anti-pattern. I cannot really tell you if it's commonly used. If it is, then we are not in the best position to maintain those solutions. It's never initially appearing for people who have knowledge on basically Salesforce architecture. And it definitely has a very small number of positive consequences in it. It's really an example of bad practice, bad pattern, if you will, but not an anti-pattern. Let's maybe go forward and broaden the scope. I'm going to talk about the Apex only things in my conversation. So you won't be hearing anything on SOQL, anything on OmniStudio, which is becoming really big in recent years. Neither I would go into general programming and talk about God objects or other generic anti-patterns. Let's discuss Apex and let's discuss Salesforce. But before we do, I really want to rant on the definition once again, because the architect salesforce.com and also some help articles have their own definition of an anti-pattern. So let's have a look here. Apex Guru anti-patterns. And you see in here DML in the loop. Well, executing DML operations inside loop cause resource consumption can hit governance limits. Yes, can, most likely will. It's part of the scalability, right? If you're trying to find a solution to scalability, putting DML into a loop is never a solution to scalability. It's just bad. If your concern is scalability, putting DML in the for loop, it's bad. Once again, if your concern is organizational security, and it's actually coming from the architect.salesforce.com, if you are looking at security, putting our usernames and passwords is actually a malpractice. You would fail any type of code review, formal code review procedures, security checks, if you do this. It's not an anti-pattern. It's bad pattern. It's bad solution. While the anti-patterns from the textbook, they can work and they kind of work, but they have a lot of bad consequences. Therefore, my topics for today are just 5 different anti-patterns we see, and I guess most of the developers are seeing in their Salesforce day-to-day activities. So I'm not going to stop on each and every one, every of them, but I would proceed directly into first one. Apex patterns in parentheses, primarily because patterns definition in Apex sometimes mixed with a library. Sometimes using some existing code, importing into your own code base because we're kind of limiting in how libraries are working for Apex. Sometimes this considered as a pattern. And once again, psychological experiment, try to think about the Apex patterns which might appear in your head. I conducted plenty of interviews, I think dozens of them. every Salesforce developer I've asked the question on which software development patterns you're using in your day-to-day Apex work, all of them responded Apex Trigger Handler. Although it's kind of using strategy from, if we're going from to Gang of 4, it's really Apex specific. And I really want to stop on Apex Trigger Handler. We will talk about him later on in more detail. But also others. The implementation of separation of concerns, how we're using the domain, presentation, and service layers, how we separate in our logic in that order. Once again, most people consider this as an enterprise pattern within Apex. We have a lib which from Financial Force, which kind of provides this with Apex Common. And we all using decorator and facade. The problem is that the most common name for decorator I heard during interviews was a wrapper, but the whole idea was exactly the same. It's really a decorator Gang of 4 pattern. Textbook's example of it. And let's maybe go back to the Apex Trigger Handler, shall we? Have you ever seen a world without Apex Trigger Handler? If you were on a project, and it was quite large one with existing database and code base, was there even a project without Apex Trigger Handler? Well, actually I saw one, and that was the project designed by a very knowledgeable person. Hence, this is a bit offensive, but still a meme, that sometimes writing code directly in Apex Trigger without using Apex Trigger Handler can actually respond to a business requirement while sacrificing some of the extensibility, openness, ability to configure it through point and click to make it really simple in terms of code. And you can think about, like, I put here 500 lines of code. That's not extragation. If you look at the repository, that's actually one of the most advanced Apex Trigger actions framework. That's how it's called, by Mitch Spano. It had plenty of commits by other people. You can actually contribute there yourself. It's well designed in terms of object-oriented programming. It follows single responsibility principle. It uses all of the object-oriented programming principles in encapsulation and inheritance. It uses, basically, it's a great example of over-engineering. However, it's there, and it's way more than 500 lines of code. Imagine you have to add 2 lines in your trigger. Yeah, that might not be the best solution to add like 2002 lines in your code base, but primarily because our libraries are working the way they work. So, why I'm seeing the Apex Trigger Handler usually get in a misuse? It's a very specific solution to a very narrow problem of keeping the order of execution of individual sub-triggers, implying that you have many, in order, so you can control this outside of your code, allow you to enable and disable triggers, those things like skipping them, disabling them altogether. All of this are very specific, nice to have requirements, really, to most of the business problems. And they hitting problems over time. The first one, which most of the people would face, is, as I mentioned, if you need a small trigger on one object of 2 lines of code and you don't have any trigger handler in your org, most of the developers are kind of like, all right, that's the first one, so I would estimate it for a long period of time, and I would really either copy and paste a lot of code, try to write my own bicycle, and implement some kind of form of Apex Trigger Handler just for this small requirement. What if it would be just like you never had to use a trigger in the first place? Maybe a flow with additional method in Apex. Maybe that would work better and would be configurable. You can disable, enable it in production without the deployment. So same idea. What about performance? This actually coming over time. if you're implementing it for quite a while, coherence between those sub-triggers or trigger actions or whatever you want to call them is going down. So they might be using exactly the same resources, gathering simple and exactly the same collections, and they can iterate over the same collection over and over and over and over again, which would hit your performance very drastically. I've been to a few projects where it was an issue, and that was basically a very big problem, costing money, costing major refactoring. So keep that in mind, that if you're going into very complex scenario, your implementation, the way how it's done, it might need a change. It might need to allow this performance-related enhancements. And the most important, among all, I'm going to talk about it in another slide, is rot over time. Every iteration, you implemented it. However, after addition to the code, after maintenance for 5 years, solution becomes worse and worse. Entropy and decay of code is happening. It's inevitable. Salesforce releases 3 times a year, adding new feature with every release, which if you actually wrote some code before we had switch case or switch when, you were facing this if-else construction, or worse, you had some mysterious, monstrous maps, and you were going over them kind of like in a way of switch when construction, just because the construction was not there. Imagine the bombardment of the new features which are coming with 3 times a year, and that's just one thing. If you implemented a very complicated trigger, imagine your project living 10 more years, and some features are needed to be added on top, which at some point it's not you who's going to maintain it, and if that person is properly trained, hopefully entropy would not be decreased. If the code review procedure is very strict, if documentation is really ready, it's going to be fine. But if you're looking at this from the perspective of the longevity, software rot is inevitable. Here's an example of what might cause a software rot. This is actually from that very cool. Once again, I'm really cool with that implementation trigger handler. It's very profound how they managed to kind of use object-oriented programming to an extent there, and really maintain it, like with modern Apex releases, to utilize all of the features. However, it's having this cognitive complexity is being suppressed, meaning that it's really, PMD believes that this is a cognitive complex class. So it would be very hard for people who maintain this to keep it as coherent as it is now. They would need to spend a lot of effort to do it, right? So keep that in mind. To decrease rot, you need more energy at maintenance level, and you have to really think about it in your implementation. How to avoid, basically, for Apex trigger or for any other Apex patterns or libraries which you can use, there are 3 things you have to keep in mind. First and foremost, we are Salesforce developers, not Apex developers, meaning that Apex is just one tool we have in our toolbox. Are you sure that that's the right one? If you're talking about trigger handler, are you sure that going with Apex trigger, synchronous trigger, is something which is absolutely necessary and you have to do it, or it's avoidable? Another thing, and I'm pretty sure that that's centered, keep the idea, keep the problem in mind. Your solution, your pattern is part of the solution. Are you sure you're resolving the problem which customer says that you have to resolve? And are you sure that there is an alignment between developer teams existing and also future? Are you working on documentation to thoroughly document it, to create proper readmes, so your complex structures are explained in a great manner. You have to do it. By doing this, even if you're using a very complex pattern, if you're using enterprise patterns directly in your Apex, keeping every option I just talked through in mind, it's really not an Apex pattern. But if you're misusing any of this, well, try to keep it simple. KISS as a principle, I think it's main, and it's going throughout my talk, because my next topic is comments in Apex. And I know that I'll be a bit controversial, but I went through multiple Salesforce projects, and I'm actually guilty of putting this into the best practices myself. But in most of them, if not all, there is a line that Apex code must be commented. Everything must be commented. Every method should be commented out, and sometimes even mandate the format, Apex doc format, for every class and method. The problem with this is there is nothing about it that comment should be meaningful, or that there should basically do not describe what's in the code, but really think about why. The key question is why. Therefore, Apex doc as a thing, for instance, it's just a tool allowing you to generate documentation in the form of static HTML pages. Like, how many of you actually did this? How many of you actually take your code, run Apex doc, have those static HTML pages integrated into some kind of solution and using it as a README? If you're ISV, I believe there might be some of you who did this. Not all of you, but some of you. But if you're a system integrator, probably it's not about yourself. And most of the comments, just like here, the method below was basically named createUser, as you can clearly tell in my repeatment here of method name. And description is really saying methods with some grammar mistakes, to create a user. Well, that's probably obvious by the name of the method, because that's you use a useful name. Descriptive function, you're really repeating yourself with that. There are some funny examples of it. If you look at the real world, there is no added value of this sign, right? It might say, well, if you're not seeing this sign, maybe this would give you some attention that had to look up. There is a stop sign, but other than that, it's a waste. If that's actual example of the bullshit job, like you're being exactly that sign, and this comment here is exactly this sign. You can read this. By the way, the code is pretty old. I know that it's null or empty. You can modify it. Yes. The point is the comment here, appending where condition. Yes, I can clearly tell that you are appending it to a query, and you checking if any, because you're checking if it's null or empty, and it's where condition. So what's the added value of this? Is it like your PM would understand, or functional consultant would read the code in some parallel universe and take a read at this and say, well, finally it's there? Maybe it is. With Apex doc, it becomes even more funny, because imagine the world where you have to look at the documentation, a static HTML page of the task class, and in its description, it's saying that, well, that's the task class for another class, which is in the name, because you had a name convention. It's very hard to miss this. What's the added value? Maybe the author. Yeah, you might want to know who wrote those precious unit tests. Or you might want to know, create a date. There is also history in here. Well, you can see the history. There are plenty of other tools which would allow you to track this. Have you ever heard about Git? Have you ever seen how you can actually roll back to previous versions, see the difference in highlighting which lines were added or removed? Also seeing who added a specific line of code through Git. You can actually do this You don't have to write that into Apex doc. Nobody's going to read this. This is just a description of what's going to happen below, and it's existing there only because it's mandatory to put this header on top of every class. Because, well, what if we need to have documentation? Then this line would definitely help us, right? Not exactly. To make sure that your comments stand out, always comment on why. Here is an example. Although, once again, I'm not fully confident with the code, this example of comment is really great. It explains what it does. It's actually having some logic in a more normal way, because and it explains why it's there, to avoid self-reference from trigger. That was an actual problem. You avoiding this by adding this extra line. So commenting on why is important. But you know what's more important? Documentation. And you better document via diagrams or how-to articles. You can use readme.md or any other format available there with to make sure that you explain why and how, but never what it is. You can tell if your PM decided to look at your code, now they can put it into whatever LLM they have, into AgentForce for developers, and ask, can you explain in plain English what is this code about? It's no longer an issue, resolving no problem. Apex doc, my heart belongs to this, but it only works for code only or code heavy projects, and only if you're using the actual output of Apex doc. Other than that, it's just a waste of space, adding a lot of greens into your code, maybe looking really fancy, but there's no value. You're not helping anybody by this. It's just a best practice of yesterday that everything should be commented out, because back in the day, commenting options to provide documentation were limited. It was not as important as today. Therefore, maybe yesterday it was the best practices. Today, you only commenting out on why. That's better to be understood. Let's go back from the code and talk about something completely different. Once again, urban legend on Soviet shoe factory. I'm going to explain you what it is, and you will probably understand where I'm coming from. Imagine back in the day, urban legend, not entirely true. I'm from Eastern Europe, and I was actually from the ex-Soviet country, so I can understand the logic and anecdotal structure of it. But imagine there was a factory, shoe factory to be precise, which were pressured to produce more shoes, but their material supply was the same. They have one KPI, number of shoes produced, but the material supply was basically either the same as yesterday or even less than that. What can you do to increase production? Make smaller shoes, make child shoes, make shorter versions of them. Use less material in your shoes. What it led to is a shortage of large size of adult shoes, and it's not formally you're doing the right thing. You're producing more shoes. On paper, it's more shoes, but in reality, you're not really resolving the actual need to produce more production because you're limited on supply. Just because something is measurable, just because something is highlighted to higher management or whatever, doesn't mean that that's the indicator, that's quality indicator, performance indicator, which should be measured from and should be optimized. We have this. We have exactly the same Soviet shoe factory principle in our Salesforce strategy. One is actually mandated by Salesforce, and that's called you cannot deploy anything to production unless you have 75% of coverage. Coverage in here measured by a line of code which are covered by unit tests. Well, integration tests, but they call unit tests anyway. And in most of the best practices, once again, guilty, I put it myself, And we saying what we're striving to cover even more than what Salesforce wants, 95%. What it's leading to is really the lines of code coverage, and you can create fake coverage. Most of the people are, especially back in the day, you ever seen these methods which are thousands lines long of, I don't know, integer adding to itself by one, and it's called forCoverage or something. And it's on paper you have a better coverage line by line, but in reality, it tells nothing about the quality of your solution. And in fact, you actually not pressuring the developers to cover all the functional cases, positive, negative, in bulk, but you're pressuring them just to get the figure right. Same idea, but it's not pressured by Salesforce. They claim that it's a best practice, but they don't put an exact number. In most of the best practices, I heard that 8 lines of method is the most, what you can try to keep it as low as possible, 8 lines, no more. Have you ever seen nested ternary operators in Apex? Question mark and yeah, well, it's literally you're trying to get, because yes, you have this limit, you want to keep it nice and small, but your logic, like, there's a lot of nested ifs which are psychomatic complexity, but still. So in order to avoid this and maybe keep less lines of the code, less symbols, using triple nested, quadruple nested ternary operators. That's the Soviet shoe factory principle in reality. What's the favorite tool for deployment, for DevOps of our PM? Of course, it's PMD, PM's favorite DevOps tool. It's not exactly the abbreviation here, but the idea is we can measure well, we're building a great code. It's very performant. It's really, we have this number, the whole set of different rules, which are checking psychomatic complexity, checking the cognitive complexity, lines of code, and all of other nitty-gritty details into real measurable figures, which you can then present to your customer and say, hey, have a look. We're building a very qualitative solution. PM's dream, really. It's not replacing hours from code review. In reality, it even increases the work needed. You know what's the famous last word is? Let's enforce PMD on existing code base 10 years old, just before we're doing production deployment. Guess what's actually happening afterwards? Well, a bunch of developers taking the old code base, trying to suppress whatever warnings they are because PMD is enforced, or they asking DevOps to temporarily disable it before we would enable it again and again and again, resulting in, well, PMs thinking that they may be, well, taking priority in terms of speed over the quality. Customer might be feeling the same, that, well, you were telling us that PMD is the way to go, is a way to measure our code, the quality, and now you're disabling it, meaning that you are not providing a performant and also qualitative code to us, which is not a great thing. Therefore, practical advices. How to not fall into Soviet shoe factory principle. If something can be measured, it doesn't mean that it absolutely necessarily have to be measured. You have to state in your documentation. You don't put an exact number. You're putting that every functional step, every functional testing for integration tests, or actual proper unit testing has to be done on the method. No matter the coverage. Coverage is a separate thing. You're covering the functional scenarios and not the lines of code. That's what really matters. Yes, 75% of the coverage of code is required by Salesforce, but if you cover the 75% of all the functional cases, you will probably be good. If you cover 100%, there shouldn't be an issue. Static code analyzer, as PMD or anything else which you can use, SonarQube, anything else, is just a tool for your code review. It really does not shed any hours for your developers. In fact, it might be adding them. It's counterintuitive for some of the PMs, but it is. Code review is not getting replaced by static code analyzer. You might want to add something which is complex cognitively into your code base. Maybe your rule is not really checking it, but in fact, the cognitive complexity is really not there. It's just, wrong rule. So you have two choices: either refactor your rule, add an exception that suppress warnings, or just do not use it. Static code analyzers are really just tool which can help you out, but also can really put you back in terms of, especially if you have a very solid code review procedure on your project. That's the anti-pattern number 3. Fourth one actually is my favorite, and I really wanted you to remember most of the things here. It's over-engineering by default. Let's think about the actual scenario. The typical day of Salesforce developer. Let's assume they're not senior, they've taken first steps, and they're coming into the very interesting world of Salesforce facing this. They have a string in their code, and they read the book, which their senior developer said they should read on code smells, and they noticed that it's magic string, right? I would put it in a constant variable, but then they think, all right, maybe it's time to move it outside of the code. Oh, and I have so many options, from custom settings to static resources, custom metadata, and I can explain this to business. Yes, it would take maybe 2 hours more, and deployment would be a bit more complicated, but it's cool configuration. Nothing is hard-coded because hard code is bad, and they know it. But it might get a bit too complex if, but we have already this custom metadata type. Should I create new one? Should I add to an existing one? Should I use custom labels? If so, how can I be sure that they are moved with the code, the value is there? It's getting so complex because you over-engineering. In reality, what would happen? You have a longer development cycle. You would spend time developing custom metadata type, putting the configuration there, testing it out, making sure it's working. You're risking more in your test case scenarios. For instance, if using custom setting, the values are not added manually. There is the code which is inserting them had never been run. Therefore, you're actually losing a lot of time. And this time which you're using, you could use to document where you actually put this configuration strings or whatever, which are controlling the behavior, the business logic, if you may, of your tool. Maybe Apex, if configuration part is as important to you as it's to business, maybe Apex is really not something to go. Maybe they can, maybe you can give them some arguments to use Flow, OmniScript, anything else really, instead of Apex. So it would be still configurable, available to admin. Admin can deactivate it if so, and it would still do the trick for them, or kind of do the trick if, once again, configuration is an important step. And once again, during maintenance time, how many of you went to an existing project, seen a long code base, using whatever number of different custom settings, custom metadata, custom labels, and all of the even custom objects to store specific business logic, and kind of lost because there is no documentation, and you're just spending a lot of time to find what's the business logic here, where you could just look at the code and guess. And how many of you actually face this very sad novel of custom metadata records which are created but never changed since creation? So somebody thought about that, it's a good idea, we keep it configurable, move it outside of the code. 8 years later, nobody ever looked at them, nobody ever changed them. Those precious hours of development work were kind of spent there on a thing which might never be used. That's the over-engineering by default idea, that You have to really think hard. You have to build it very complex. Well, in reality, yeah, is it really resolving any business issue? Ask yourself those questions. I talked about it in the previous slide, but it's very important. Do you sacrifice time in documentation, in reading how-to articles, in ensuring that people who are going to maintain the solution actually know what to do? Are you sure that if configuration is something business actually they ask for it, they want to change this business logic, they see that it would change? Are you sure that Apex and some custom metadata is the way to go? There are no other options. They cannot really simplify some of their flows, so you can use standard Salesforce for it, or flows or whatever from point and click. And are you sure that everybody from your team would use exactly the same logic as you to extend? Like if, for instance, they would need to add an extra variable and you chose custom labels, are you sure that all of them would be using custom labels? Are you sure that all of them would be using custom settings if you're using custom settings for whatever reason? That's the problem, and that's very individual. You have to really control this by best practices documentation. But make sure that you're following, keep it simple, and you're going to need it principles. Right solution has to be chosen. Think about it. If you're building MVP, if you're building proof of concept, building up the custom metadata type is probably, in 95% of cases, it's probably an overkill, which you probably want to spend your time on some other features or documentation, which would be as useful for business as, well, as anything else, really. Documentation, think about it, really, documentation is better to have up-to-date, very full documentation, other than profound, complex custom metadata with, for instance, JSON stored there as a text areas and then deserialized into some settings in Apex. It looks complicated, it's cumbersome. And if you don't have time to document it, people who are going to maintain it after 5 years would have a very, very tough time doing it. Want to stop this on one of the favorites of our conversation, utility classes. Utility classes are everywhere. You probably face them as base util, as util class, whatever, they are there. You can have multiple variations of them. You can have multiple different smaller classes, map util, string utility, whatever, or you have one large class. All of them, at least 90% of what I saw ever, is there is no such method in the library. There is no such method in any Apex class which we can use from some open source libraries. So we have to write it ourselves. There is only a small fraction of the methods which are not falling under any domain or service layer, and they really are kind of outstanding and you don't know where to put them, and you put them into utility class. That's really not the best place for them. Problem, you maintain them, you copy and paste them from project to project without thinking, because yes, I get used to calling util dot something because it's probably something which I'm using like for 4 or 5 years, but it's really copy and paste programming. It's not how it should be done. And once again, you know you might be using utility class, but are you sure your future colleague would use it exactly the same class, would even know about its existing in the org? That's the class, those are the methods, and would know all of them and use them exactly the way you do? That's a problem I have with utility class. How to deal with them like a real boss? Go into idea exchange. I know that I'd be a bit controversial with that because yes, Switch When was delivered like 9 years after IDEA was created, but maybe even more. I don't remember, to be honest. But I remember I was very happy when it was delivered. Thank you, Salesforce team. While it's not delivered by Salesforce team because they're working on something as important as Apex, go open source. There are tons of Salesforce projects now. You can contribute to existing projects. Just check out the Fuxigenic website. It's pretty awesome to group most of the open source projects we have in Salesforce. Create a pull request, or if it's something very specific, you can create your own pull request, create your own repository. Make sure that you go in open source. It's really a name of the game. You would see the change. And once again, if it's not the library method, right? If it's not something which is just missing from there is like normal programming, you have a library. It's a very specific utility class. Make sure that it's in the right space. Make sure that you're using single responsibility principle. And that specific class is there. And through every review, specifically have a closer look to any changes to this utility class. Because from cognitive perspective, I believe most of the developers saw this and felt at some point a fear of adding new classes. It's actually a thing. It's actually an anti-pattern. You as a developer thinking that maybe I can put this small method somewhere, it doesn't really belong anywhere, so I would just append it to a util class, I guess. Just make sure that you really think about single responsibility principle and you would not violate it with your recent changes. Let's quickly go back. We talked about Apex patterns and how to really implement them, especially trigger handler pattern. Talked about comments, talked about actually solid factory principle and everything measurable through PMD or other static code scanning tool. We talked about over-engineering and utility classes. And I really want you to remember this: very simple things, very simple principles. Keep it simple, you ain't going to need it. Think about maintenance. It's maybe even more important than the build, but at least keep it as important as build. Keep an eye on every Salesforce release. Keep an idea that anti-patterns are not always bad. They are a solution, but to a very specific subset of the problems. And not every pattern or library should be used. Do not think about it as a shop where you can buy everything. No. Last, and for most of the Apex developers, if you're specifically like me, but yeah, like I was 7 years ago, and you are thinking that I know Apex, I know other programming languages, I can solve any problem and I can do it really immediately. I can spend some time, not sleep, just code it and it will be resolved. Not every problem can be solved, and not every problem needs an immediate solution. The second thing is more important. That was it, and if you have questions, I believe I would be able to answer you in chat when it would be aired live on YeurDreamin event, and see you somewhere around. Bye!